Hello and welcome to the next lecture of IGCSE Biology 0610 series. In this lecture, we will discuss second part of the sexual reproduction in plants. It's lecture 4th and we will discuss pollination in this lecture. So let's start. So let's take a quick recap, a quick revision of the last lecture in which we discussed the basic structure of flower. As you can see in this diagram, we have discussed that there are four basic parts of a flower: petal, sepal, stamen, and carpel. Where stamen is the male reproductive organ and carpel is the female reproductive organ. You can see in this picture also, it is petal, the pink one. These are the sepals, the green ones. This is stamen, the yellow ones. Stamen is further divided into anther and filament, and this is carpel in the center of the flower. It is the female reproductive organ. It is divided into stigma, style, and ovary. The upper portion is the stigma, then tube-like structure is a style, and basal swollen portion is ovary. Pollination. What do you mean by the term pollination? Pollination is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Let's try to decode this term. Pollen grains are male gametes and anther is part of stamen, which is male reproductive organ. Stigma is part of carpel, that is female reproductive organ. So what is pollination actually doing? Pollination is transferring the pollen grains or the male gametes from the male reproductive organ to the female reproductive organ for the sexual reproduction. Pollination is essential for the process of sexual reproduction. As you can see in this diagram, these honeybees are transferring pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the another flower, and this process is called pollination. This process is pollination, transfer of pollen grains. As the name suggests, pollination. Pollination is transfer of pollen grains. Now this transfer can be on flowers of same plant or another plant. Now insects can transfer this pollen grains from one flower to the another flower of the same plant or another plant. When the pollination occurs when the anther, which contains the pollen grains in it, matures. It bursts to release the pollen grains, and pollination occurs. So exposure of pollen grains is essential for the process of pollination to complete. Now let's understand what are the modes or agents of pollination. How the pollination occurs. Pollination occurs with the help of insects or wind. There are other modes also, that is through animals, water, bats, but the major agents of pollination are insects and wind. So now let's try to understand the difference between the insect-pollinated plants and wind-pollinated plants. First difference is between the flowers of these two plants. The flowers of insect-pollinated plants are brightly colored and scented, because they have to attract the insects by their colors and scents. They have nectar also. Insects usually come to these flowers for collection of nectar. But the wind pollinated flowers are green, not scented, and they do not have any nectar because they don't have to attract the insects. Next is in the size of flowers. Insect pollinated plants are basically large in size because insects have to sit on them, while the wind pollinated flowers are small in size. Next is anther. The anther of the insect pollinated plant is present inside the flower, while in case of wind pollinated plants, it is hanged freely in the air outside the flower. It is essential for the exposure of pollen grains to the air so that the pollen grains can be easily blown by the air. Next is stigma. Stigma of insect pollinated plants is also present inside the flower. Both the anther and stigma are present inside because they are not exposed. They don't need to be exposed to the air. While in case of wind pollinated plants, stigma also hang outside the flower. It is essential to trap the pollen grains that are carried by the wind. Also, stigma is large and feathery in appearance as compared to the stigma of the insect pollinated plants. Next is pollen grains. What is the difference between the pollen grains of insect and wind pollinated plants? The pollen grains of insect pollinated plants are sticky and spiky. They have spikes, which is essential for the pollination. As they are sticky, they can stick to the insect's body and insect can easily carry these pollen grains. They appear like a fine powder. While in case of wind pollinated plants, pollen grains are smooth and lightweight so that they can easily carried by the air. Next is, what is the difference in the quantity of pollen grains produced in these two plants? Both the plants produce large amount of pollen grains. But if we compare these two, wind pollinated plants produce more pollen grains as compared to insect pollinated plants because the chances of loss or damage of pollen grains in case of wind pollinated plants is more because they are carried by wind and wind can blow anywhere. So to increase the chances of pollination, the pollen grains are produced by large amount in wind pollinated plants. Next is examples. Insect pollinated plants are lupin and wallflower, while in case of wind pollinated plants, examples are grass and cereals. So these are the basic differences between the pollen grains and plant features in both these plants. Now let's take a look of the picture of pollen grain. This is the pollen grain of insect pollinated plant. You can see here the pollen grain has spikes while it is smooth so that it can be easily carried by the wind. It is wind pollinated pollen grain. Next is wind pollinated flower. This is wind pollinated flower. You can see here that the anther and this is stigma. Both are hanged freely in the air and are present outside the flower. Stigma you can see is feathery and long, so that it can easily attach the pollen grains to it, which are blown by the wind. While in case of insect pollinated plant, the anther and stigma both are present inside the flower. They are not hanged in the air. So these are the basic differences between these two type of plants. Next is, what are the types of pollination? There are basically two types of pollination. One is self-pollination. Second is cross-pollination. Self-pollination is transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. While the cross-pollination is transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower on a different plant but same species. So what's the basic difference? In case of self-pollination, the flower can be same or different flower of same plant. While in case of cross-pollination, plant is different. Plant is different. While in case of self-pollination, plant is same, single plant. This kind of pollination will take place in single plant only. Let's see how it occurs. Let's suppose this is a one plant first and this is plant second. They both are of same species. It is essential that they should be of same species, otherwise the pollination will not occur and the pollen will die. If the pollination occurs in this flower only, from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, it is self-pollination. If pollination occurs from this flower to this flower or this flower or from this flower to this flower, that is in between the different flowers of the same plant, then it is termed as self-pollination. But if the anther or pollination occurs in between these two plants, first and second, or we can say if the anther gets transferred from plant first to plant second, then it is called cross-pollination because pollination is occurring on different plant. It is cross-pollination. Hope you understand this. And as I just said, if pollen grain lands on the stigma of a plant of different species, then it dies. So this is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now let's see what are the effect of cross-pollination and self-pollination on variation, capacity to respond to environmental changes, and third in reliance on pollinators. In case of self-pollinated plants, variation is less. Variation is less because a single plant has same type of gametes, so chances of variation are less. While in case of cross-pollinated plants, the gametes of two different genetic composition combine to form a new combination of genes which will lead to genetic diversity. Genetic diversity, which will create variation. So cross-pollinated plants show more variation than self-pollinated plants. Next is capacity to respond to environmental changes. Due to more genetic diversity, cross-pollinated plants have better chances of adapting to environmental changes. As the environment changes, the genetic composition also adapts, or genes also respond to these changes. And when genes change, genetic composition varies, gametes also varies. So they have better chances of adapting to the environment. Next is reliance on pollinators. Cross-pollinated plants have 100% reliance on pollinators, because for cross-pollination there must be some medium, insect or wind must be present to carry the anther to the stigma of another plant. While in case of self-pollination, anther and stigma can by chance come in close contact and pollination can occur, but it is impossible in case of cross-pollinated plants. So they are more dependent on pollinators as compared to self-pollinated plants. So these are the effects of cross-pollination and self-pollination. So that's all for pollination. Thank you. In the next class, we will discuss fertilization. Keep practicing, keep learning.